Admittedly, today's sermon is a little more philosophical and theological in nature. And I hope that you're just track with me, because it sets the ground for the new series that we're starting today. And the new series is called Death is Dead. Everybody say that with me. Death is dead. That is worth being excited about and being thankful for. Death is, in fact, dead. That's the Easter message. And we're going to track through Luke 22 through 24 the next 4 weeks. And the progression is this: Luke 22, we read some of it earlier today, and it's the preparation of the Passover meal. Jesus is gathering his disciples. They're in the middle of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is the Passover festival. And that's the scene for the Last Supper that we celebrate during our communion liturgy. Then it goes progressively in the story. The next thing that occurs is the disciples jockey for who is the greatest in the kingdom. And that's kind of Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane is sandwiched between his disciples wanting to be the greatest, Jesus' deep prayer of humility and pouring out of self, and then Judas' betrayal. So you've got the selfishness of the disciples, Judas' betrayal sandwiched right between Jesus, the King of the universe, in doing the opposite, pouring himself out. That'll be next week. And then if you keep going on that progression, Luke 23, Jesus goes before the Sanhedrin, before Pilate, and before Herod, the religious leaders of the day and the political leaders of the day. He comes face to face with those, ushering in a new kingdom. We're going to talk about that in week 3. And then, of course, leading up to the cross, death, and resurrection as we close out the series, looking at the fact that death is, in fact, dead. But today's sermon title is Death is Dead, ... but not yet. Because people still die today, don't they? Is there not yet still pain and suffering in today's world? This has been posed as the problem of evil in philosophical thought. The problem of evil is essentially this: if God says that he is all-powerful and all-loving at the same time, how could it be that there is also so much evil, pain, injustice, and suffering in today's world? Matthew 28, when Jesus was on the earth, Jesus came and spoke to them, and he said, "All power in heaven and on earth are given to me." Then later in Revelation, it says, "I am the Alpha and the Omega." This is Revelation chapter 1. "I am the Alpha and Omega, says the Lord, who is, who was, and who will come, the Almighty." Then in verse 18, "I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I'm alive." Death is dead. "I'm alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys to death and Hades." Well, if you hold the keys to death and Hades, dear Lord, why is it that you vanquish death, sin, evil, pain, suffering, you name it, and yet we're still here languishing and struggling? You know, this question of the problem of evil has held many people back from faith. It's held many people back from trusting in God because they cannot resolve the existence of a good, loving, all-powerful God who may allow pain, suffering, and evil. So today, I'm going to approach the question and hopefully build for us some foundational structure, as it were, to support the question. This is a very complex question. It's one that is okay to ask if you've ever asked yourself that. God can handle any question that you throw at him, and it's one that's worth circling and dialoguing and unpacking. And as for celebrating the Easter story, which is of resurrection from death, how do we as believers create some robust answers to this question rather than just a little Christian pat on the back and say, "It just takes a little bit of faith, brother, a little bit of faith, sister, just don't worry about answering it in your own mind, just believe." Now, faith is an important aspect, and it takes belief, trust me, that extra step. So I'm not diminishing that, but faith is a significant element of it, but there are other ways to approach this question, the question of theodicy. Theodicy is just a theological term for the defense of God, not that God needs defending, but how do we resolve this question of the problem of evil? An all-powerful, good, loving, gracious, faithful God, and yet there's pain and suffering in the world. Before I can give you the solution, we must first establish the problem. And just so we're clear, we've got a problem. If I had a jar of water that was purified crystal clear, representing creation as God originally made it, as God originally designed for it to be, if I took just one drop of black dye and put it into the water, it pollutes the whole lot. And that's essentially what happened in creation. 1 Corinthians 15 tells us just that exact same narrative. Listen to what it says. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 21. For since by one man came death, by another man came resurrection from the dead. And that's alluding to the Genesis story. And in Genesis, we see this. God said to Adam and Eve, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day you eat of it, you shall surely die." Now, God didn't necessarily mean immediate physical death because Adam and Eve ate of the fruit and didn't immediately die. God put a clock on their life, and they lived into their 900s. You don't hear that phrase very often. But God was talking about a spiritual death. There was a death of the soul that was happening as well. Romans 5. As by one man sin entered into the world by sin and death, and so death passed upon all men. One drop of dye corrupted the whole lot. We could not be connected to a righteous, perfect God. He could no longer indwell the temple that he had created. Remember, heaven is a God plus earth reality. He intended creation to be something that he indwells and is in relationship with. And he could no longer do that when it was rebellious and corrupted. We can't underestimate how fundamentally original sin has changed all of creation. And we've lost that in today's world. Why? Because in our postmodern mind, we believe that our opinion is good enough to become truth. And however I feel and however my emotions may lead me that way, or whatever I think in my own wisdom, well, that suddenly becomes my truth. And we've lost the sense that we are starting from a corrupted, lost, and rebellious starting point. And if we lose that from our understanding of what it is that's occurring, well, now you can understand why people just elevate their own personal opinion to the level of truth. How I'm feeling in that day. What a mistake when we miss this idea that fundamentally we need salvation, that we need a rescue plan. So I can't give you the solution until we establish that problem. Sin has entered the world, and therefore death has entered the world. But God put a plan in place to kill death, that death would die its own death. The plan of Christ, the plan of redemption. So if Christ's work, which happened about 2,000 years ago, was put into place to kill death, then why are we still suffering today? Why is there still death today? Why is there still pain today? Let me give you a few columns to support this structure, as it were, and answer this for us, so that we have some serious, robust questions when life's circumstances might cause us to want to doubt this truth. When life throws difficulty at us, we need to prepare now for the difficult day so that we don't have a crisis of faith when pain, suffering, and evil or injustice look at us straight in the eyes. And this is the first thing I want to offer. Column number 1, supporting structure. It must be said that things are actually, in fact, much better today than they were before Christ in terms of the progression of humanity. Now, this goes because of the influence of Christians in the world. Now that has a big fat asterisk next to it because Christians have not gotten it right all the time. We fumble along the way and make all sorts of mistakes. You could point to elements like the Crusades and others where we just did not do it right. Just because a Christian was involved doesn't mean it's going to necessarily be progress. However, you can point to countless schools, hospitals, the progression of medicine, science, technology, arts, the music, the classical composers who elevated the progress of humanity that was driven because of their Christian faith. So yes, there's pain, injustice, and evil, and in some ways things are worse than ever, like human trafficking. But at the same time, it must be said that things have progressed because of the drive of believers. Consider that for the new morality that was provided for civilization as a result. For example, the Spartans, the great Spartans, they found it completely normal to abandon your child on a hillside because they were just weak. They wanted to thin the herd of any weaker children. Infanticide was also common practice and would have been kind of morally acceptable. You have early Christian believers that were called to live to the standard that Jesus had given us, might have been further advanced in their morality, like some of the classical greats that we quote, or Roman Stoic philosophers like Seneca, who was the great philosophical thinker of the time. And yet, non-educated Christians might have been more morally advanced than some of those great thinkers because of the regenerative, transformative power of the Holy Spirit in us. In ancient patriarchal systems, women were more likely oppressed and not given a voice in their cultures. But around Jesus and some of the early church, women became to be given positions of status, and even women's suffrage movements later on were driven by people of faith. There was a certain equality to humanity that was given by the Christian faith, and even fighting against slavery. It was William Wilberforce's faith in Christ that led him to fight against slavery in Great Britain, eventually being abolished in 1833. And in this own country, you could make the case that the First Great Awakening, followed on by the Second Great Awakening, was the seedbed that laid the spiritual foundation that would eventually lead to the potential civil war where we're fighting against slavery in this very country. We believe that we have been given certain unalienable rights by a creator. It's the Christian faith that has brought up so much in architecture, arts, science, technologies, humanities. So, is there still evil, injustice, and pain and suffering in the world? Yes, but it must be also identified that a lot of progress has happened because of the belief in Christian faith. Just one column out of many. If this was a table that needed to be supported, I'm just giving you some legs to help support this structure. The second column is very close to the first one, and it's this. The problem of evil is how this is postulated and postured and phrased. However, in the same way that you could say we have the problem of evil in today's world, you could flip that same question on its head and say, well, you could also call it the problem of love. Because yes, there's pain and suffering and injustice, but there sure is also love. Have you looked into the face of your child recently? Have you gone across the causeway and looked at the rivers and been filled with beauty and wonder or awe? This past week on the same day, I visited Blake and Marissa McKinnon in the morning, welcoming their firstborn child into their family. Tell me there isn't love. And on the same day, in the evening, I visited another church member in hospice. Yes, there's still death, pain and loss, but there sure still is love, and there still sure is hope, and there still sure is joy in this world. It's not just all pain, suffering, and evil. So evil is still a four-letter word, but thank God, so is love. So this is another column to go, this thing is more complicated than just discarding the idea of God because there's pain and suffering in the world. Hold on, pump the brakes, let's look at this a little closer. So Christians have been the force of good for so much throughout the last 2,000 years. You've got to contend with the fact that love is also a part of reality. That's not just the only thing is just pain. In fact, if God could only have created creation in three different ways. Either one where it's just mechanical and robotic, where he controls everything as a master puppeteer. It could have been total chaos with no rules of any kind, anything goes. Or the third option is what we got, a plan and a design with the ability to insert free will. Now, we can turn left and we can turn right, and by golly, we sure have. But the third option is the only one that allows for us to choose him. Love is inserted in this way. The problem of love. Here's the third column for you. When people say, I cannot believe in a good, all-powerful, loving God because pain and suffering exist, the very question, the very statement itself presupposes the existence of a universal law. Because you are saying hungry children are unequivocally evil. Poverty is bad. Human trafficking is bad. The loss and death is a negative thing. You have just made a universal law, and therefore, if there is a universal law, there must be a universal law giver. So in the attempt to dismantle the very idea of God, and I'm quoting Ravi Zacharias here, in the attempt to dismantle the idea of a loving, almighty rule giver, the very question itself presupposes a universal law giver who designed creation. And the scriptures tell us that he's written his law in our hearts. That's column 3. Column 4, as we continue to try and answer this question and support the structure with some more robust answers. How is it that death can be dead, but we're still experiencing pain? Here it is. I believe we need to change our view of suffering. And I'm not saying that God's heart and desire is for us, his children, to suffer. It's not. But if we look to the church fathers and those saints that have come before us, they give us a perspective on suffering that it's not a hot, cold, either or, black and white scenario. They tell us a story where suffering can have an important role in our journey towards eternity, friends. Isn't this God's plan? Resurrection through the path of crucifixion. This was God's plan. New life through death. A seed has to be buried and planted and die for it to give new life. You know, when we suffer in life, sometimes, if you talk to people who've gone through really difficult times, who've lost it all, it has the ability and opportunity to bring you closer to God, to inspire in you a clinging and a desperation for your Lord that the good times can't. It inspires an intimacy with him. And so the idea that just because pain or suffering may exist and we should just run away from it at all costs, it could be a false floor to our journey of faith. Why? Because pain and suffering have the ability to chisel off of my heart the selfishness and my proclivity to my own mortality. It makes me confront my own idols and makes me answer the question, what is really important to me? When all seems lost and life circumstances are as hard as they could be, suffering can have a role. Listen to this quote from St. Jerome. I've read it for you before. If you are deceived if you think that a Christian can live without persecution. He suffers the greatest who lives under none. Nothing is to be feared than too long a peace. Why? Because a storm puts a man on his guard. and obliges him to exert his utmost efforts to escape the shipwreck. Yes, the storms of life have an ability to get us into lockstep and focus like the easy times can't. Jesus never promised us to save us from all pain and suffering in this life. No, he said instead of he would be with us through the storm and in the fire. What does Psalm 23 say? Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Psalm 23 doesn't say, I will fear no evil because you promised to always keep me out of the valley of the shadow of death. No, it says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will be with you. He promises his presence even in the midst of pain and suffering. So Christians, column 1, have contributed to the progression of humanity and civilization in unbelievable, magnificent ways. We don't just have the problem of evil, we've got the problem of love too, because the world is full of all this joy, hope, and God's good pleasure. The question itself, how could there be a good God in the face of evil, presupposes a universal law and a universal lawgiver. And we should change our perspective on suffering because it has a pivotal role on our journey Godward. And here's the last one, and I'm bringing it back to our journey through Luke here. Death, here's the last column I'm going to offer you for today. Death is dead, but not yet. Death is actually dead. What's occurring here in Luke 22, as Jesus is breaking bread with his disciples during the Passover meal, he's correlating himself to Hebrew history. Don't miss this. It's so cool. You have to see the Old Testament and the New Testament as a continuation of the same story. The Bible is the most unbelievable, magnificent book that humanity has ever looked at. How could 66 books with over 40 different authors over spans of thousands of years have this correlative red thread all throughout? And Jesus is on the scene now in Luke 22, the Lord's Supper, Passover meal, and he's essentially saying to them, a new covenant is being established. If you're not familiar with the Passover tradition, when the nation of Israel was in slavery in Egypt, the last of the plagues that came through was the death of the firstborn male in the Egyptian households. However, if you sacrificed a Passover lamb and painted your doorpost with the blood of that lamb, the angel of death skipped your home, no death, and the death was only brought to the other homes. That was the last thing that finally let the nation of Israel go, where Pharaoh said, get out of here, this is it, we've had enough. The nation of Israel celebrates the Passover to remember all of that. Now, Moses took the nation of Israel out of slavery, and before going to the promised land, there was a season of wandering in the wilderness. Jesus is positioning himself as now the fulfillment and the perfect execution of so many of these Old Testament characters. He is the new David, the new king. He's the new Elijah. He's the new prophet. He's the new Passover lamb. And he's also the new Moses, here to take God's people out of the slavery of now death into our ultimate promised land, new creation. Now, before the nation of Israel went ultimately to the promised land, there was a season of wandering. There was a season of wilderness. And we find ourselves, friends, in this similar position. Yes, as Revelation 21 says, one day he will wipe away every tear, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain, nor any more. The former things will pass away. But we today are living in a historical moment where the new Moses, Jesus, has taken us out from under the power of death. Death is dead. He's taken us out from the power of slavery, and we're following him, and we're helping him establish and bring his new world order. There is a season of wilderness. There is a season of wandering. And one day, as Revelation 21 says, he will wipe away every tear. There shall be no more death. But that is a future that is coming. 1 Corinthians 15, listen to what it says in verse 26. Paul says, the last enemy that will be abolished is death. So this is Paul writing it. Christ has already gone to the cross, died, and resurrected. So after that work is done, Paul is still saying, futuristically, the last enemy that will be abolished, annulled, canceled is death. At the second coming of Christ, why is there still pain, suffering, loss, death today, even though death is dead? Because we're living in the in-between, friends. We're living in the already but not yet time when death has been Jesus was victorious over death on the cross. But now, our King is asking us to live in faith into the reality that one day death will be vanquished once and for all. The last enemy to be vanquished. Are you with me? You tracking here? So we have pain and suffering today, yes, because we're living in the already but not yet of God's kingdom. That means we've got work to do. That means we've got people to save. That means we've got good news, hope, joy to spread, and love, because our King is riding on a white horse. And I want to wake up every day like I'm standing on the front lines with him, ready to charge into the battle. Because death is dead, but he is leading us now through this season of wilderness and wandering until his kingdom finally comes. Psalm 44, we read it earlier. You are my King and my God, who decrees victories for Jacob. Through you we push back our enemies, not through my own capacity. Through your name we trample our foes. When life circumstances, when pain or suffering looks you in the face, we conquer that through his name. I don't put my trust in my bow. My sword doesn't bring me victory. It's not my own capacity or my wealth or my network or my connections. That's not what brings me victory in life. No, you give us victory over our enemies. In God we make our boast, and I will praise his name forever. God's plan, resurrection through crucifixion. Next week we're going to look at exactly just that. The call to die to self. That for death to truly die, we must die to ourselves first.